Okay. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hopefully we'll have the sound amplified with not too much more delay here, but I am delighted to be introducing Dr. Ken Fincham, who's coming to speak to us today. I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Fincham for the first time several years ago now in his role as the British director of the Virginia program at Oxford. Each year, he comes to campus to welcome the new cohort of Hampden-Sydney VPOers and prepare them for their time on the program, which he's going to be doing right after this talk. So unfortunately, we won't have an enormous amount of time for questions, but we should have some. All right. Today, however, we are delighted that he will be speaking to all of us about our college's namesakes, Hampden and Sydney. Dr. Fincham is especially well suited for this task. He's a professor of early modern history at the University of Kent and has published extensively on politics, religion, and culture in early modern Britain. His most recent work, The King James Bible, Crown, Church, and People, was published by the Cambridge University Press in the Journal of Ecclesiastical History in 2020, and he's got many other projects which I will not list so that we can continue and hear from him directly about this subject. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. So can I begin by thanking Charles Adams, who I gather is not here, and the 250th Anniversary Committee for this opportunity to talk to you about John Hampden and Algernon Sidney. I just want to give you a very brief introductory view on their significance for 17th century British history, which is the period I know. On the other hand, I won't be presumptuous enough to venture into 18th century American history, nor examine why these two figures' names were picked for this college at a particularly important transitional moment in America's history. What I say will be very much an introductory set of remarks. So if you're an expert on both, this is the moment to leave, and I won't be offended. Okay, so from the 1750s, in England at least, the two names, Hampden-Sydney, were frequently linked. A popular slogan was the cause for which Hampden bled in the field and Sydney on the scaffold. Both, in other words, had died as a result of standing up to the tyranny of Stuart monarchs, Charles I and Charles II. They were patriotic heroes. And if we move on another half century to 1803, this was the year when the war against Emperor Napoleon was resumed. A popular song called Britain Strike Home was published, and evoked a whole series of historical characters to encourage national defence against the anticipated invasion by the French. Among them were Alfred the Great, Elizabeth I, William III, the Duke of Marlborough, and Hampden and Sydney. And so here's the relevant stanza. Repel the foe that, desperate, dares invade the land protected by great Sydney's shade, and in the cause for which your Hampden bled, should every Briton's blood be freely shed. So in other words, by the very beginning of the 19th century in England, Hampden and Sydney had become beloved, not just of Whigs or radicals or romantics, but all patriotic English people. What I want to do now, briefly, for about 50 minutes, and I hope there'll be time for a few questions at the end, is review the careers and the ideals of these two men, and as I do so, to question whether they actually represented the two sides of the same coin of English liberty, or in fact are the differences between them as marked as similarities. Did they represent contrasting responses to the challenge of a century of political turmoil, centering on the civil wars of the 1640s and 1650s and their aftermath? Did the 18th century, in fact, remodel both to suit its political purposes and aspirations? So first, some dates. John Hampden was born in 1595 and died fighting Charles I in 1643, shortly after the start of the First Civil War. Algernon Sidney was born in 1623 and died exactly 60 years later on the scaffold. They were nearly a generation apart, and there's no evidence that they actually met. It's true that both were MPs in the Long Parliament that opened in November 1640. But Hampden was one of those elected in November 1640 as already an extremely experienced and influential MP. Sidney, in contrast, entered Parliament in 1645, 2 years after Hampden's death, as a freshman. The more significant point is that while both opposed what they saw as the abuse of executive power, they were involved in different stages of that long 17th century struggle. Hampden, as an opponent of Charles I from the 1620s through to his death in 1643, Sidney, who fought for Parliament in the 1640s, supported the English Republic of 1649 to 53, then became an enemy first of Oliver Cromwell and then of Charles II and the restored monarchy after 1660. So I want to take them in turn. So let's start with our consideration of John Hampden. And here he is, but it's very interesting. There's no contemporary portrait of the man, and this is one of the earliest we've got by a Dutch artist, Michael van Gogh, of 1713. Hampden was born into a gentry family in Buckinghamshire, but was not among the most wealthy or powerful in the county. His home was Great Hampden in the Chilterns, and very close to the county of Oxfordshire. He was educated at the local town of Thame, where years later he was to die after the Battle of Charlegrove. And Oxford University was merely 30 miles away from home. So it's no surprise that he was enrolled as a student at this college, Magdalen. Like so many, such as Oliver Cromwell, Hampden didn't take a degree, but 3 years later he did go to London to study at the Inner Temple and learn the rudiments of law, which was vital for any political aspirations, either at local or national stage, and indeed to be an effective landowner. Key to Hampden's future career was his religion and also his political allies. His family were staunch Protestants, believing in the Calvinist doctrine of predestination. His mother was born a Cromwell, so Oliver Cromwell was actually a cousin. And in the 1620s, Hampden became part of that group we can talk about as political Puritans or Puritan parliamentarians. In other words, in religion, hostile to all aspects of Roman Catholicism, and pushing for further reform of the Church of England in its doctrine, but also its worship. And politically, suspicious of moves both by James I and Charles I to extend their authority. The precise limits on royal power and royal prerogative was a long-standing and contentious matter by the 1620s. For example, was the king's prerogative regulated by law or superior to law? Could the king raise money without the consent of Parliament? How much role did Parliament have in shaping the Church of England? There was no right or wrong answers to these questions. Both the king and his critics could cite precedents in their favour. But it did mean there was plenty of ideological debate and division, which, in the event, ended in civil war in 1642, though I think that wasn't the only possible outcome of these disputes. As for Hampden's associates and political allies, they included figures like Sir Richard Knightley, Lord Say and Seal, John Preston, all advocates of a Puritan agenda and willing to stand up to what they saw as the abuse of ill-defined monarchical authority. Now, the first occasion that Hampden became a figure of national prominence was 1627, when he refused to pay Charles I's forced loan, which of course wasn't a loan at all, but it was a tax imposed without the consent of Parliament. Hampden was imprisoned for the best part of a year, since he challenged its legality. In Hampden's view, if the king wanted money, he should summon Parliament. And Hampden would not bow to political pressure to pay up. He was elected to the Parliament of 1628, and in a rare speech articulated what we call the Popish conspiracy theory. In other words, there was an attempt round the young king Charles I to subvert the Protestant religion and the ancient liberties of the kingdom. This view wasn't Hampden's own idea at all, but it becomes widely accepted among the king's critics in the late 1620s and then re-emerges with serious consequences on the eve of the English Civil War. Let's move on 10 years to 1637 and the event for which Hampden is best known, his prosecution by the king for refusing to pay ship money. To make sense of this, I need to give you a little context. Having fallen out with his English Parliament in the first 4 years of his reign, in 1629, Charles I decides, for the time being at least, to rule without calling Parliament, and relying instead on his prerogative powers as head of state. Ship money had been around since the 1590s. And the way it had emerged and developed was that in time of war, the government could requisition merchant ships from coastal towns to augment the navy just for the short period of that war. In the 1630s, Charles I revived ship money, but entirely changed its character. Everyone should pay, not just those living in coastal towns. Instead of an occasional demand, ship money became annual from 1635 onwards. And rather than borrowing merchant ships, Charles demanded money. In large money, because naval warfare now favoured ships of the line, which were far bigger than most commercial vessels. And here's an example. This is Charles I's flagship, the Sovereign of the Seas, launched in 1637. You would not find a merchant ship looking anything like this. Above all, Charles justified ship money on the grounds of national security. Yet England was at peace in the 1630s rather than at war. Charles I couldn't afford war. If he had a war, he would have to call Parliament. So there were plenty of grounds for Charles's critics, like Lord Say Seal and John Hampden, to believe that the king was abusing his prerogative powers and that he was illegally raising money to avoid calling Parliament. So much was at stake here. Hampden refused to pay some, but not all of his ship money contribution, and in 1637 the Crown decided to prosecute him. It was a test case for the legality of ship money, heard by 12 of the most senior judges, and generated an enormous amount of public interest. The case took over 4 months to be resolved, and in the end, Charles won, but by the narrowest of majorities, 7 in favour, 5 against. So the moral victory belonged to Hampden. And several judges in the minority had their speeches circulated through manuscript copies. The most popular, to judge from surviving copies, was by Sir George Crook. And his absolute opinion, quote-unquote, was that ship money was, quote-unquote, illegal. Contrary to common law, since not granted by Parliament, expressly contrary to some statutes, and not supported by prerogative powers, nor any danger to the realm. How far the judgment affected the payment of ship money in the year that followed is very hard to assess, because precisely that time Charles I is preparing for war against the Scottish Covenanters, and therefore raising new sources of revenue that were equally controversial, particularly coat and conduct money. But Hampden was now a national figure, and in 1640 Charles I was defeated by the Scottish Covenanters, who occupied north-east England, and the king had to call Parliament and had to listen to demands for reform. And here was the moment for Hampden and other Puritan parliamentarians to try and reshape church and state with a weakened king. Let me move on briefly to the coming of civil war in 1640 to 42. Hampden was a leading light in that group that contemporaries and later historians have called either the junto or the Puritan knot or the fiery spirits. In other words, experienced and influential opponents of the king, sitting in the Lords, the House of Lords, as well as the House of Commons. And alongside Hampden was John Pym, Denzil Hollis, the Earls of Northumberland, Bedford and Warwick, Lord Say and Seal once again, and waiting in the wings, one Oliver Cromwell. They were not Republicans. The only Republican known in the House of Commons in the early 1640s was Henry Martyn, who was imprisoned in 1643 by fellow MPs for demanding the removal of king and kingship. Instead, what Hampden and his allies were working towards was a limited monarchy, its powers defined and restrained by law. They were looking for regular parliaments and for privy councillors who enjoyed the trust of Parliament. Similarly, the Church of England should be reformed into a thoroughly Protestant church, something that simply hadn't happened in the middle of the 16th century, and purged of all traces of Roman Catholicism, including government by bishops. Charles I was prepared to make some concessions, but not enough to satisfy his critics, so political stalemate ensued by the autumn of 1641. In early January 1642, Charles I tried to break this deadlock by arresting one member of the House of Lords and 5 members of the House of Commons, including John Hampden. The 6 were accused of undermining the king's powers, trying to destroy his reputation with his subjects. And some of the articles went back to 1640, and Hampden was one of those who was accused of collaborating with the enemy, with Scottish Covenanters, to see the English defeated and the king required to call Parliament. And I think the articles demonstrate the depth of the political crisis that now occurred between king and Parliament. Famously, the 6 had been tipped off so that when Charles arrived in the House of Commons to arrest them, they were nowhere to be seen. Here's a 19th century depiction of that moment. All MPs could mutter very loudly was privilege, privilege. In other words, Charles I had no right to be in the House of Commons and no right to bring soldiers with him. And I think it was the decisive moment in the move to civil war. Charles no longer felt safe in his capital city and left London in search of an army. And 7 months later, war broke out. In 1642, Hampden was appointed a parliamentary colonel and showed signs of being a successful leader in war. However, on the 18th of June 1643, so in other words within a year of civil war beginning, he was mortally wounded at the Battle of Charlegrove, just outside Oxford, which by that stage had become the king's headquarters. And he was taken to the nearby town of Thame, where he died. And here's a 19th century imagined picture of his funeral at Great Hampden. And here, if you go to Thame, is a modern monument in favour of Hampden, which is very hard to read. So let me reproduce on another slide the quotation at the end by the Earl of Clarendon. Now, Clarendon was a royalist, not a parliamentarian, chief minister to Charles I and then Charles II. So in other words, a political opponent of Hampden. An author, too, of perhaps the best, most influential history of the Civil War, the history of the Great Rebellion. And therefore his praise is rather striking and telling. And it reads, when Parliament began, he's referring to the Long Parliament, the eyes of all men were fixed on Hampden as their patri pater, and the pilot that must steer their vessel through the tempests and rocks that traced it, for his reputation for honesty was universal, and his affection seemed so publicly guided that no corrupt or private ends could bias them. However, the inscription omits some criticism by Clarendon of Hampden. He also wrote that Hampden, quote, had a head to contrive, a tongue to persuade, and a hand to execute any mischief. So here's a backhanded compliment, acknowledging that Hampden was a formidable politician, and had he lived, would certainly have shaped post-war England. Let me now move on to consider the career and concerns of Algernon Sidney. While Hampden was a member of the country gentry, Sidney was an aristocrat. He was the second son of Robert, Earl of Leicester, while his mother was daughter of the 9th Earl of Northumberland. His home was Penshurst Place in Kent, and family for Sidney mattered. First, he saw the aristocracy, ideally, as holding the balance between the arbitrary powers of the crown and the disorder of the people, in what he cherished as a mixed monarchy. Second, his great-uncle had been Sir Philip Sidney, the epitome of the Elizabethan humanist and Protestant activist, who died on the battlefield fighting the Spanish in the Netherlands in 1586. And I think Philip was a role model to Algernon for his learning, for his religion, for his political engagement, and his connections across Europe. Now, unlike Hampden, we have plenty of evidence of Algernon Sidney's thinking and writing, especially his sprawling discourses concerning government, first published in 1698 after his death, but also his court maxims, which remained in manuscript and were unknown until they were discovered in Warwickshire Record Office in the 1970s, and not published until 1996, which gives you a sense of how scholarship on Sidney is still developing. Sidney, quite possibly because of his aristocratic background, was also a prickly, quarrelsome individual who could not bear contradiction, rather different from John Hampden, the smart and persuasive political operator. The family crest of the Sidneys is a porcupine, which seems highly appropriate for Algernon Sidney. Sidney's career falls into three parts chronologically: from his youth to 1660, mostly in England, in exile from 1660 to 1677, and then his return to England in 1677 until his execution in 1683. So I'll take these in turn, and while doing so, try to identify his thought, his aspirations. Sidney, unlike Hampden, did not attend university. Instead, as a teenager, he travelled abroad with his father, the Earl of Leicester, who was British ambassador in Paris in the late 1630s. Like many of the Sidneys, he was widely read. A contemporary, Bishop Gilbert Burnet, noted that, quote, Sidney had studied the history of government in all its branches beyond any man I knew. And so Sidney drew on Aristotle, on Plato, on Machiavelli and Renaissance writers, and to reflect on the origins of government, on liberty, political morality and religion. Sidney joined the parliamentary side in 1643, saw action and was wounded at the Battle of Marston Moor outside York in August 1644. He was elected to the House of Commons the following year, but played only a very minor part in events leading up to the trial and execution of Charles I in January 1649. It's clear, I think, that Sidney's own views at this time were still taking shape. 10 years on, in 1659, Sidney described regicide, the killing of Charles I, as, quote, the justest and bravest act that was ever done in England or elsewhere. 10 years earlier, however, he held that the king could not be put on trial and that the court had no legitimacy because it had been set up by the New Model Army. It seems to have been his experience of the English Republic from 1649 to 1653, which replaced the monarchy, which helped firm up Sidney's beliefs. He emerged from this period as one of a number of classical republicans, as they are known, devoted to the new order and seeing its liberty and its martial valour exceeding the ancients. And Sidney himself became a member of the Council of State of the Republic in 1652. As he wrote in the discourses in the 1680s, looking back, neither the Romans nor Grecians in the time of their liberty ever performed any actions more glorious than freeing the country from a civil war which had raged in every part, the conquest of two such kingdoms of Scotland and Ireland, and the crushing the formidable power of the Hollanders by sea, nor ever produced more examples of valour, industry, integrity, and in all respects complete, disinterested, unmovable, and incorruptible virtue than were at that time seen in our nation. Sidney, like other classical republicans, was appalled at Oliver Cromwell's actions the following year, 1653. First closing the Rump Parliament using armed force, and then accepting the title of Lord Protector, a quasi-monarchical office. Here's Oliver Cromwell's death mask, which you can see in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Sidney regarded Cromwell as a tyrant and withdrew into private life, only to emerge to serve very briefly in the revived English Republic of 1659, following the death of Oliver Cromwell in September 1658. On now to the second phase of Sidney's career. Without the commanding presence of Oliver Cromwell, the Protectorate and the English Republic fell apart, so that in the spring of 1660, Charles II was invited back from exile to take the throne. Sidney initially accepted this change, since the invitation had been issued by Parliament. But he quickly became disillusioned with the Restoration monarchy of Charles II. Sensibly enough, the new king had tried to offer peace and reconciliation after 20 years' upheaval, but he drew the line at those who had signed the death warrant of Charles I in January 1649. And this included Sidney's dear friend, Harry Vane, who was executed in 1662. Sidney himself was vulnerable, since in 1659, while ambassador in the Baltic, he had lavishly praised the regicide, and this was widely reported. So much so that in the summer of 1660, while he was still abroad, his father, the Earl of Leicester, warned Sidney not to return to England. So began 17 years of exile, spent in Rome, the Low Countries, but principally France. His opposition to Charles II deepened, as the king's promise in 1660 to offer liberty of conscience or religious toleration turned into a narrow, intolerant religious settlement just 2 years later. I mean, to be fair, that was not Charles's wish at all, but it was something that forced upon him by the Cavalier Parliament in 1662. But Sidney was also repelled by the corruption of the Stuart court and the arbitrary actions of the new king. Too many echoes here, in other words, of his father, Charles I. When in 1665 the Protestant Dutch Republic went to war with Royalist England, Sidney urged the Dutch, whose leader, De Witt, he knew well, to mobilise English exiles himself, invade England to restore the Long Parliament, overthrow the king, and ensure the return of political and religious liberty. To accompany this, Sidney picked up his pen and wrote court maxims. And writing with Puritans and dissenters in mind, he urged them to overthrow Charles II, So to quote from it, all that are friends to reason and justice are obliged to destroy that monster. In the event, of course, nothing came of this. So Sidney, by the 1660s, was advocating armed resistance to tyrants such as Charles II. I think this had an important religious inflection, which I've already touched on in passing. Although Sidney did not wear his religious allegiances on his sleeve, his religious beliefs were not detached from, but rather enthused his politics. Sidney was a staunch Calvinist, probably like Cromwell, a Congregationalist or Independent, if we want to put a label on him, who willingly called himself a Puritan and championed the interests of the elect saints who had already secured their place in heaven. As Michael Winship has observed, for Sidney, quote, world history revolved around the saints' struggles. Divinely sanctioned republicanism was the form of polity best suited to support them in those struggles, and the saints themselves were a republic's ideal citizens. In other words, the saints had showed obedience and activism in their religious life, and so could exercise political virtue in civil government. So I think we can talk of Sidney's belief in Calvinist republicanism. He desired a polity framed by just laws and based on the consent of the people. This could be monarchical. In other words, Sidney was not narrowly doctrinaire, but in practice this was likely to fail, since monarchies were beset by corruption and by tyranny. Godly magistrates in a Calvinist republic would protect the interests of the saints, who in turn would be exemplary citizens. Yet Sidney was much more than just an uncompromising advocate of armed resistance. At times, he could be a pragmatist, even an opportunist. While in exile in France in 1670, Sidney made overtures to that monster, his term, Charles II, through the eminent soldier Marshal Turenne. Sidney suggested to Charles II that he could best secure the stability of his kingdom by offering liberty of conscience, even for Catholics, whom Sidney disliked less than English Protestant bishops. This is a fascinating switch of tactics by Sidney, hoping to achieve something through conversations rather than through resistance, and highlighting for us his concern at the suffering of the elect saints in England. Sidney, in fact, was arguing a policy on Charles II, which the king himself had long believed, and would put into practice in his declaration of indulgence just 2 years later, in 1672. Had Sidney perhaps got wind of this through his contacts at the English court? Now, Charles II's response is revealing, as recorded by the French ambassador in London. Quote, he knew the said Sidney for a man of great courage and spirit, though also the most opinionated republican he had in his whole realm. Sidney had promised, and that was the least he could do, that he would not do anything against him as long as he lived. And that is interesting evidence, of course, of Sidney preparing the ground for this offer. And he, Charles, is persuaded that his realm will never be at peace if liberty of conscience is not accorded to all the principal sects. So in other words, Charles actually agrees with what Sidney is recommending. After speaking several times of the dangers of the said, Sidney concluded it would be best if he was sent back to Languedoc, and he could not be far enough from England. So let me turn now to the final stage of Sidney's career, from his return to England in 1677 to his execution in 1683. Sidney came home to see his sick father, the 2nd Earl of Leicester, who died 2 months after his return. He then spent much of the next 5 years fighting for his inheritance as a second son through the law courts. Now, these 5 years saw the crisis of Charles II's reign, known as the Exclusion Crisis, and its aftermath, the Tory reaction or the personal rule of Charles II. What had happened is the king had pursued policies in the 1660s and early 1670s, at home and abroad, which revived all the fears of popish and arbitrary government once levelled at his father Charles I. Equally destabilising was the fact that from 1673 it was widely known that Charles II's brother and heir, James Duke of York, had converted to Catholicism. So, in the three parliaments between 1679 and 1681, there were attempts by the House of Commons and the House of Lords to bar James from succeeding to the throne after the death of his brother, on the grounds of his Roman Catholicism, but also to deal with present politics, to try and restrain some of Charles II's powers and prerogatives. And behind this crisis, we can see some important ideological questions. Did Parliament have the right to regulate the succession? Did the King have the right to manipulate how often and for how long Parliament should sit? During the crisis, we see the emergence of the forerunners of modern parties. The Tories, believing in a strong monarchy, and though being Protestant, backing James II as he became claim to the throne, versus the Whigs, in favour of limited monarchy and anxious to stop a Catholic becoming king. The Whigs also championed the plight of Protestant dissenters, those who had been persecuted under Charles II's religious settlement from 1662 onwards. And this, as I've already indicated, was a cause close to Sidney's heart. There was serious talk in 1680 and 1681 of another civil war. But in the end, Charles II won through, blackened his opponents as extremists, and determined not to re-summon Parliament again, which is actually the case. So the last Parliament of his reign was 1681. Charles dies 4 years later. He should have called a Parliament under the Triennial Act in 1684, but he disregarded that and was able to get away with it. And during that period of 1681 to 5, which we call the Tory reaction or the personal rule of Charles II, we can see Charles and some of his ministers hounding down, chasing down his most vocal opponents, particularly the Earl of Shaftesbury, and using the law against them to silence them or drive them into exile. Now, Sidney was on the fringes of the exclusion crisis, at least publicly. He made 5 unsuccessful attempts to get elected to Parliament between 1679 and 1681. But we know he followed developments closely as he was living in central London and was in regular touch with radicals in the City of London in favour of exclusion, such as Slingsby Bethel, and also in regular touch with leading exclusionists in both Houses of Parliament. Sidney himself supported exclusion since he believed that Parliament had the right to dispose of the succession. After all, that's precisely what they had done in 1660 by inviting Charles II to return to England and take the throne. But Sidney's focus was broader than just exclusion. In 1681, he began his Discourses Concerning Government, a large, rambling discourse on liberty, government, and resistance. Its target was a book published as long ago as about 1630, Sir Robert Filmer's Patriarchia. But that book had remained in manuscript and had only been published in 1680 by defenders of the king's authority against the Whigs and against the exclusionists. Filmer had claimed that political authority didn't derive from the free consent of people, but from the patriarchal authority of Adam. And this divinely created authority was then transmitted to his monarchical successors. So in England, according to Filmer, monarchs controlled the law and allowed Parliament to meet, not as a right, but as an act of grace. In short, there's no space here for limited monarchy, but it's an articulation of English absolutism, and its publication in 1680, in Sidney's view, demanded a refutation. The discourses contain many of the ideas I've already touched on, of the natural liberty of the people, of the means and ends of government inspired by Sidney's reading of the ancients and Renaissance theorists. And I won't repeat these ideas here. His treatment of rebellion was innovative, deploying Grotius' doctrine of a just war between states and applying it within a state. Redress through resistance applied at all times. And if you reflect on that, that would present some challenges to any ruler, and was justified by the laws of God and the laws of man. The application of all this to the politics of his day was made explicit. If possible, the tyrant Charles II should be brought to trial, just like his father. But if that was not possible, extrajudicial means would be necessary. But it wasn't enough to destroy the tyrant, but leave the tyranny. Parliament must be called, which could settle the succession and determine on the terms on which the new monarch would succeed. As the government's control over its exclusionist opponents tightened after 1681, and persecution of Protestant dissenters intensified, there were plots and rumours against the regime. One of them was the Rye House plot of 1683, to murder both the King and James, Duke of York. The second seemed to have centred on Sidney, with a number of aristocratic friends, such as the Earl of Essex, Lord Howard, Lord Russell, and the King's bastard son, the Duke of Monmouth. Given his views on resistance, this should hardly surprise us. Sidney hoped to raise the Covenanter Scots, as in 1639-40. But nothing came of such plans. It was mostly conversations, before the government swooped, and Sidney was the first to be arrested in June 1683. The prosecution needed 2 witnesses to prove treason. One was Lord Howard, who turned King's evidence, but a second could not be found. And it's clear enough from his correspondence that in the autumn of 1683, Sidney is hopeful that he might, after all, get off the hook. The Crown decided that its second witness would be parts of the discourses discovered in Sidney's study. Could a man be found guilty for what he wrote but had not published? According to the presiding judge, the infamous George Jeffreys, the answer was yes. To write is to act. Like others tried in this period, Sidney was denied counsel, he was denied a copy of the indictment and notice of the statute on which it was based. The difference was that Sidney was determined to draw public attention to the patent injustices of the legal proceedings. Prior to sentencing, he stated in court that I humbly conceive I have had no trial, and repeatedly rejected Jeffreys' crucial ruling that to write is to act. Once sentenced to death, Sidney carefully prepared his political legacy as a martyr for godly liberty in his apology and his last paper. And here is a revealing extract. I thought to leave this testimony unto the world, that, as I had from my youth endeavoured to uphold the common rights of mankind, the laws of this land, and the true Protestant religion, against corrupt principles, arbitrary power, and popery, I do now willingly lay down my life for the same. And here we have a contemporary image of his execution outside the Tower of London on the 7th of December 1683. Let me end this lecture with a brief comparison of our two protagonists, Hampden and Sidney. Both were politicians and soldiers who fought against arbitrary rule by the Stuarts. In his discourses, Sidney related all the trouble of Charles II's corrupt reign to those of Charles I. In other words, the restoration of the monarchy in 1660 had restored all the troubles that Hampden had opposed in the 1630s. For both, the solution lay with Parliament to check royal authority and bring malefactors to justice. Both Hampden and Sidney were also committed Calvinists, driven forward by their faith as well as their politics. But the differences are also striking. Proud and irascible Sidney versus Hampden, the stealthy political operator. Hampden pushed for limited monarchy, working with regular parliaments and presiding over a thoroughly reformed church, while Sidney often despaired of monarchy altogether and looked for a polity where civic and religious virtue could be pursued. But Sidney's beliefs also incorporated the God-given right to resist, the upheavals and instability which he saw as central to politics. Hampden had picked up his sword to resist Charles I, but Sidney was at war with tyranny wherever he saw it. His entry in the register of the University of Copenhagen in 1659 sums up a great deal. This hand, enemy to tyrants, by the sword seeks peace with liberty, which I believe is the motto adopted by the state of Massachusetts. As Hampden's experience was confined to England, so in contrast, Sidney was at home in continental Europe and saw the problems of the day in international terms. Both Hampden and Sidney were much admired by some contemporaries and feared by others. And I wonder if we have here two enduring types, the consummate politician versus the radical visionary. Thank you very much. So I'd very much welcome any questions. We've got about 8 minutes. Yes, please.
So Hampden-Sydney Square is believed in liberty with Louis XIV when he was in France. / what did Louis XIV think about having a character like Sidney around?
That's a good question. I think in some ways Sidney saw the real enemy as not Louis XIV but the Dutch Republic, as an ungodly bourgeois state. Louis XIV, he came to terms with as Louis came to terms with him because he lived for most of the time in exile in France, had connections, saw himself part of the European Republic of Letters, and indeed ended up getting a pension from the French ambassador when he returns to England. He's prepared to work on behalf of Louis. So I think he saw his French connections as useful. First, in the way I said, when he's trying to push Charles to offer indulgence to dissenters. And then, secondly, as perhaps a counterweight to what's going on in England, even though Louis XIV is the greatest ally of Charles II. But he's looking for support, he hopes. And France is a country that he feels comfortable in. So I think possibly the explanation is this is one of those tensions that perhaps exist inside all of us, which we don't choose to confront. Cognitive dissonance, if you like. But the fact is he seems to be able to hold those in parallel and feel that they're not contradictions that need to be resolved. Yes?
First off, thank you for a really interesting talk. So, as I understand it correctly, while Sidney was a Republican, Hampden was really in favor of a limited monarchy. What did he think that a monarchy, what purpose would it serve that a parliament couldn't just do on its own? Was it that he had in mind something like an executive office, like a president or a prime minister, or was it more of a theological issue for him than a political issue?
Thank you. Yeah. I think for Sidney, his preference was a republic, but he didn't entirely reject monarchy. But looking around his own lifetime, he saw two examples where monarchy led to religious tyranny or political tyranny. So it wasn't the best option, and England in particular demonstrated that of Charles I and Charles II. Hampden's view, I think, was that, like many of his generation, it was a very big step to reject the monarchy, particularly when the monarchy had been established in English society and English history for centuries, closely connected with the law, and that produces problems later in the 1650s with a republic. And so it sounds like double thing to us, but I think for many it was quite genuine. They went to war with the king to preserve kingship. Charles was just using the office. And it was an opportunity, too, to resolve long-standing tensions going back really to James I's reign, possibly into Elizabeth's, about ill-defined prerogative powers. So one of the things that King and Parliament go to war over in 1642 and 16 Church, that's doing something, and the these should be thoroughly under parliamentary control, which in fact happens from 1642 through to 1660. But in terms of politics, the area where the king and critics come through is council. So what they want is a privy council which effectively controls Charles. The problem is Charles, not the office he occupies. But Charles is quick to spot this. He says they want to turn me into a Doge of Venice, so that I reign but I don't rule. And, well, republicanism, I think, even if we move to the end of the decade after Hampden has died, is quite a minority taste. They killed Charles I because they feel they've got no alternative, and then move to republicanism as the best alternative given they can't work with a king or a monarch. So I think that's the case. Whether Hampden would have become a classical republican is a fascinating, unanswerable question. But the fact of the matter is we know relatively little about his internal thoughts. We have to deduce an awful lot from his actions. And it's possible, given his close association with this junta that's moving against Charles, his connections with Cromwell, perhaps he might have come to embrace that view of Cromwell, that necessity dictated the execution of Charles I. But there's a fascinating book by David Coman on radical parliamentarism in the 1640s, who demonstrates that certainly in London, as early as 1643, 1644, 1645, the unspoken thoughts are beginning to be articulated in press, which is the problem is Charles, the problem is monarchy. For a long time, MPs stepped back from endorsing that publicly. But by the time Charles refuses to negotiate in good faith, in 1646 and 47, they're beginning to think, well, perhaps we've got to think of an alternative. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you for the talk, of course. So regardless of the sort of, problems with the trial of Sidney, could you comment a little bit about how Sidney was involved or wasn't involved with the White House plot to assassinate Charles James?
I think the evidence is most unclear.
Okay.
What we do know is it appears there was something called the White House plot, and simultaneously, Sidney was holding conversation with his aristocratic friends, saying, look, we're suffering, senators are being persecuted, there's no prospect of a parliament, something's got to change. And we have got clear evidence he's thinking of trying to appeal to the Scottish Covenanters who are being persecuted by Charles II in Scotland. But they seem, I think, to come out of the same sense that the opponents of Charles are now cornered, and either they've got to be silenced or go into exile and take up arms. But there is no direct evidence that he was part of the Rye House plot trial. But enough evidence, of course, in his papers to damn. Cheers.
Early on, you mentioned a reference to Hampden-Sydney and a certain call to action as late as 1803. I'm just wondering how those figures may change such a strike. The presence, I guess, then in public discourse for such a long period of time.
Yep, really good question. I think what happens is a little bit of rewriting by the Whigs from the 1680s, particularly 1690s onwards, after the Glorious Revolution. Once sort of Stuart despotism has been, it appears, put behind them forever. And so we have the memoirs of Edmund Ludlow, who's a central figure in the 1640s, being edited and removes any reference to his religion at all. You wouldn't believe he was a Puritan. What we got of the discourses may have received something of the same treatment. It's not published until 1698, so that's 15 years after Sidney's death. And there may have been some judicious editing going on there. But essentially what the Whigs are looking for are suspicion of executive authority, of patriotic Englishmen who look at government and think, this will resonate with you, I'm sure that government should be limited and should be checked, and that they're looking for those who appear to possess incorruptible virtue. And Sidney presents himself precisely in this light. It was a bit of a shock later on when they discovered he was getting a French pension, which was precisely the sort of corruption he denounces in his own writings. So Hampden is famous for ship money and the attempted arrest of the 5 members and dying in the battlefield. Sidney for the way he presents himself in the scaffold, but also in the discourses published shortly thereafter. So there are 2 models of the struggle of Englishmen to preserve liberty. And I think that's what resonates through the 18th century. And they do become symbols, not much more than symbols. Okay, thank you. Well, thank you.
Thanks again.
Thank you very much.